Today's video is going to be my most disappointing books of 2024, so we're going to be talking about some books that disappointed me this year, of which there are not actually that many. I think I have about 6 books that I'm going to be talking about today. Because of the nature of this video being a little more negative than usual, I am going to have timestamps in the description just in case you would like to skip any of these reviews. If you're super excited about any of these books and you don't want to hear me rant about them, it's cool. I'll have the timestamps in the description so you can do that. But I am also going to be going into mild spoilers for some of these books. I'm not going to ruin the books as a whole, but I am going to go into a little more detail than I would in a normal wrap-up. So with that out of the way, let's get into the video and talk about the first book that disappointed me this year, which was Dial A for Aunties by Jessie Q. Sutanto. So I read Vera Wong's Unsolicited Advice for Murderers by this author in January or February, and I really loved it. I thought it was so charming and funny, and I wanted to check out some of this author's backlist. Dial A for Aunties was not my kind of humour, and there were certain things that happened within the plot that really didn't sit right with me. So this follows a woman who, at the start of the book, she goes on this blind date with a guy who turns out to be a creep. There's this accident and he ends up dead, but instead of calling the police, she decides to call her aunties to help her cover it up. So you really have to suspend disbelief. There's certain things that happen in this book that would not happen in real life, but you have to really roll with it and just accept it's happening for the sake of the plot. And I think that's where I struggled initially. They basically end up putting him in this massive chest freezer, which ends up being shipped to this hotel where this wedding is taking place. So this family actually owns a wedding business, and the following day they are organising this wedding that's like super high profile. So you can imagine there's a lot of shenanigans that ensue. They end up spending most of the book trying to retrieve this body. Then there's also a mystery involving the wedding, which I'm not going to go into because it doesn't happen until later in the book, and this book isn't really a mystery. There's also a second chance romance, but again, this isn't really a romance. It's kind of a mix of a few different genres, but the predominant genre, I would say, is that it's this satirical comedy, and I did not like the humour. So I'm going to give an example, which is a little bit spoilery. There's a point in the book where they finally find this freezer. It turns out that the guy wasn't dead before they put him in the freezer, but he is now because they put him in a freezer. And the way that it's just kind of brushed off as not a big deal, oh no, whoopsie, we accidentally killed him. I didn't like it, I didn't find it funny, and it really annoyed me. And there were a few instances of things like that happening where I just didn't find it funny, but I can understand why some people would, because humour is so subjective. So while I haven't continued this series, I am going to continue with the Vera Wong series because that one I did really enjoy. Next up we have Keep It in the Family by John Mars, which is the book that made me realise I need to be a lot more picky with the John Mars books that I'm reading. I loved The One by John Mars, and most of the books set within that dystopian universe. He writes 2 types of thrillers, sci-fi thrillers and popcorn thrillers. I love his sci-fi thrillers, but I'm learning that I don't like his popcorn thrillers, which makes sense because that's a type of thriller that I don't tend to enjoy anyway. For some reason, his popcorn thrillers tend to be a lot darker than I personally like, and they end up making me feel really uncomfortable. So Keep It in the Family is about this couple who buy a house and they end up discovering something horrific in the attic. That's all you need to know about the plot. I feel like knowing much more than that could end up spoiling the book. You do get the perspective of a serial killer, and even though it's meant to make you feel uncomfortable, I think maybe because I was listening to the audiobook, it was just not a pleasant listening experience. I also found it really predictable. There wasn't really anything in this book that surprised me. Wouldn't really recommend unless you like really dark domestic thrillers, and yeah, from now on I think I'm going to stick with his sci-fi thrillers because I know that I tend to enjoy those. Next up we have The Women by Kristin Hannah, which actually won the historical fiction category of the Goodreads Choice Awards this year. I can kind of see why, but also I had such mixed opinions on this book. I gave it 3 stars, however those 3 stars were for the audiobook. The audiobook is narrated by Julia Whalen, one of my favourite audiobook narrators. That's what carried me through. I found myself wanting to listen to this audiobook because I wanted to find out what was going to happen, but I didn't like what happened. So this is following a young woman called Frankie who at the start of the book decides to enlist as a nurse in the Vietnam War. She does this because her family are very proud of their military history, and her brother also enlists as a soldier. The first half follows her as she goes to Vietnam, and it's about her experience over there, which, as you can imagine, it's horrific. There's a lot of graphic descriptions and visceral imagery, which makes you feel very grounded within that setting. The second half then follows what happens afterwards, and it's about how these men and women were treated when they returned home from the war, and I appreciated how Kristin Hannah was shining a light on this part of history. I understood what she was trying to achieve with this book. Frankie really goes through it. However, as a main character, I found her frustrating. I feel like that's what Kristin Hannah was going for. I think she wanted to create a character who wasn't perfect. And it wasn't that really bothered me. It was the romantic elements. So I did not like any of the romantic elements in this book. If you've read this book, just know that I hated the ending. I saw it come in a mile away and I didn't like it. So yeah, I gave this 3 stars, but the more I think about it, the more I remember the stuff that I didn't like. I have read a few Kristin Hannah books and really enjoyed them. The Nightingale is one of my favourite books of all time, but I didn't feel any emotional attachment to this story, so it didn't affect me in the same way as her other books have. Next up we have An Education in Malice by S.T. Gibson, and this one hurts because I loved A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. I think it was one of my favourite books the year that I read it, which I believe was 2022. An Education in Malice was therefore one of my most anticipated releases for this year, but I found this so boring. I really struggled to get through it. It's sapphic vampires, and how do you make sapphic vampires boring? There's basically no plot. We're following these 2 main characters, Laura and Carmilla, who have this academic rivalry, except it all felt very forced. I didn't feel like they really had that much chemistry. When it very quickly turned from rivals to lovers, I just wasn't really feeling it. There's also this inappropriate relationship that Carmilla has with their poetry teacher. I thought that could have been explored in more depth. I thought this could have had some really interesting commentary on power dynamics, but it didn't really go into that. I felt like there was a lot of telling and not much showing. For example, we're told that Carmilla is super popular and has loads of friends, but do we ever actually see her with any of these friends? The atmosphere was fine and the writing was technically okay, but I think what I loved about A Dowry of Blood was how cathartic it felt. There was so much emotion in that book, and that was really missing from An Education in Malice. So I haven't decided if I'm going to pick up any other books by this author. I know that S.T. Gibson had another book released this year, Evocation, but I've heard mixed things about that as well, so let me know if you've read it and if you'd recommend it. But right now I think S.T. Gibson is no longer an author by author for me, which is a shame because A Dowry of Blood was just so fantastic. Another 2024 release that disappointed me this year was Lady Macbeth by Ava Reid, another author who I've read from and enjoyed in the past, but this book felt so pointless. I don't really understand what the author was trying to achieve with this story. I should start by saying that I'm not that attached to the original story of Macbeth. I read it, well, I studied it when I was in school, and I could vaguely remember that it's about this guy, Macbeth, who's told a prophecy by 3 witches that he's going to become the King of Scotland. He's then encouraged to fulfill this prophecy by his wife, the Lady Macbeth, who's portrayed as being someone very shrewd and ruthless. I was really intrigued by the concept of a retelling of this story. I don't think the main character in this book was that interesting. We're following this 17-year-old girl who is sent by her father to Scotland to marry Macbeth, and we're told that she is very politically savvy. We're told that she's super clever. However, we don't see any of that. Literally everything seems to happen to her, and she doesn't seem to have any agency. There's a point in the book where she realizes that she has to do something, and instead of owning it and thinking, okay, I need to do this because it's what I need to do to survive, instead of her being strong in that way, she's portrayed as someone who's very weak, and she's thinking, oh, I don't really want to do this, it's not me. And I felt like the author was trying to make us feel sorry for her, but that just wasn't satisfying. It's not a compelling character to read about. There's also a romance which I thought was very poorly developed. In fact, there was a point in the book that honestly it shocked me. The main character goes through this horrific assault, and then in the next chapter we see her be intimate with the love interest, and it felt very jarring how quickly that happened. It didn't sit well with me, it didn't feel realistic, and oh, there's also a dragon at one point in this book. Just goes to show you how random this felt. I felt so just like jolted out of the story when that happened and gave this one 2 stars. Think I was being generous. Okay, we are losing the light because I have been rambling on for ages, but I only have one more book left to talk about, and that is my worst book of the year. It's the only book that I've given 1 star, and that is The Teacher by Freida McFadden. I know that Freida McFadden is a very hit or miss author for some people. I find her books entertaining. If you go in with low expectations and you're just looking for a fun time, then I think her books are generally very addictive. However, I hated The Teacher. Surprisingly, it's about a teacher who is married to another teacher and they both work at the same school, where he is seen as the fun, attractive young teacher and she is seen as an ice queen. No one likes her and they think she is too strict. We're also getting the perspective of a teenager called Addie, I think is her name, and she is a student of both of theirs. Something happened the previous year where another teacher was fired and accused of having an inappropriate relationship with Addie, so she is being very heavily bullied and that made me uncomfortable. Obviously it was meant to, but I didn't enjoy reading it, and I also didn't enjoy that this is a book about grooming. It's been compared to My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell, which is a book that I didn't enjoy but I did appreciate it. I think I gave it 4 or 5 stars. I thought it had some really interesting commentary. This is something that I've actually realised this year. I can handle reading dark topics when it's in a certain genre. So popcorn thrillers is a big no. I don't like it when sensitive topics are written in a very flippant way. It was very uncomfortable and it probably didn't help that I was listening to the audiobook and so I was having to listen to this girl being groomed by a teacher. Like the last chapter was just no. Would not recommend, 1 star, hated it, hated it, hated it. That does bring me to the end of this video, just in time because my camera battery is about to run out, but thank you for watching if you made it this far. Let me know in the comments if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you liked it and click subscribe if you would like to see more videos from me, but otherwise I will see you next time. Bye.